So yesterday we talked about creating alt mixes for potential libraries or music supervisors that you might be in contact with. Today I want to talk about submitting mastered versus unmastered final mixes and as well as stems. So right now I've been requested to submit this track that I actually composed probably more than a year ago. I kind of got sat on the sidelines, and now finally my contact that I work with, we found a home for it. We're going to get this licensed. It's going to be great. But now I have to go back to my session and kind of start providing the stems and the mastered or the unmastered versions of it. So what they've requested is they want a mastered full mix of the entire song, and then they want the stems, meaning, you know, kick, snare, hi-hats, bass, brass, strings, high strings, low strings, etc. Every section of instrument basically broken up into its own audio file and submitted along with the mastered version. But they want those stems to be unmastered. So when you get into the TV film world, you'll come across this all the time. So I just want to show this real quick video on how you make sure you're submitting what they want when they ask for something that's mastered or unmastered. So mastered, and I'll give you guys a little sneak peek of this track, not the whole thing of course, but just a little bit. And I have my mastering plugins enabled. This is like a dubstep / orchestral kind of a track that I got going on. So here's the intro. And that's where we're going to cut it off for you. But anyway, so we have our mastered, mastering plugins enabled. So this is basically loud, it's pumping, it's going to be at the volume that I want it to be finally. So what I did is I went ahead and just bounced the track as is with my mastering plugins enabled and everything at the volume that I wanted it. But when you're ready to submit your unmastered stems, what you need to do is you only keep your add limiter engaged here, and you'll actually go to probably the loudest part of your track, and you want to make sure that your output is staying somewhere between -3 and -9 dB, somewhere in there. You don't want it hitting 0. You don't want it to be clipping, obviously. You need to give whoever's going to be taking your stems and doing some further work with them, either mixing, mastering, whatever, you got to give them some space to be able to crank up your tracks and do what they need to do. So what I'll do is I'll go to the loudest part of my track, which is probably the second half of this chorus. So as you can see, yeah, the highest I ever got was -3.3 dB, so that's great. You kind of want to keep it under that 3 mark when you submit them. So what I'll go through now is I'll literally group all of my instruments together, bounce them all, and I keep my loop where it is to make sure that my length of each stem is exactly the same. So no matter who gets these stems down the road, they can literally click and select all of them, drag them into Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton. It doesn't matter what they drag them into. They're all going to be the same exact length, so they all line up perfectly. So it's much easier to make sure that they can mix them and do whatever they need to do stems wise. In the TV film world, stems are becoming much more popular, much more common. Oftentimes what happens, which is kind of crazy, is sometimes a music supervisor will just ask for a bass stem or maybe drums and bass, and they'll just put that under a scene because they just want something low and kind of pulsating underneath everything, but they don't want a full musical track to be distracting from the dialogue happening in the scene. So you might find that as you're submitting to some libraries or some opportunities, they might ask you for stems. It's not every time. I'll tell you, for me, it's probably about 50-50. Sometimes they just ask for those alt mixes that we talked about in yesterday's video. Other times they won't want your entire track broken down in the stems as well as a final mix of the full version. So it just kind of depends on what each individual library's use and purposes are. So I hope this helps explains the difference between submitting mastered versus unmastered final stems and mixes.